The stink of sweat and whiskey clings to the air as you push through the muddy streets of San Francisco. The year is 1849, and the city feels more like a fever than a place. Boots splash in horse dung, fists slam onto bar counters, voices roar about fortunes waiting in the rivers. Steam rises from cooking fires, thick with the grease of salted pork. Every sense is assaulted at once, and yet all you can see are men rushing, wild-eyed, chasing a dream glittering in their minds more than in their pans. You clutch the handle of a crate, your knuckles white. Inside are shovels, simple wood and iron, heavy and unremarkable. But here, in this city where desperation rattles like dice in every palm, those shovels are worth more than nuggets. Every miner who charges north to the rivers needs one. Every hand that trembles with greed is ready to pay 10 times what they would back east. You are no miner, no gambler. You do not need to pan for fortune. You carry it in your hands. The crowd surges around you, men elbowing each other for space, sailors shouting from ships abandoned in the harbour, preachers warning of sin in voices already drowned by laughter spilling from saloons. A drunk stumbles into you, breath sharp with sour ale, muttering about striking a claim by dawn. He sees the crate and reaches for it, eyes glazed with hunger. You jerk it away, heart pounding, and watch him vanish into the tide of bodies. Here, every object is prey, every man a predator. Survival depends not on muscle alone, but on speed, on cunning, on how tightly you can grip what is yours. You duck into a side street where the noise dims, only slightly. Here, women lean from second-story windows, calling out prices in voices that cut through the din. Children chase one another through the mud, barefoot, their laughter edged with hunger. A shopkeeper hammers boards over a door, eyes darting at the chaos outside. And beyond, at the far end, stands Samuel Brannan, San Francisco's loudest prophet of gold. His voice carries above the mob, calling, "Gold from the American river." Men rush toward him as if toward salvation, not knowing that every shovel in his shop is marked up 100-fold. You grip the crate tighter, sweat burning your palms. Around you, fortunes rise and fall in hours, men gamble their lives on whispers, and the streets reek of both promise and ruin. In the rush for gold, you see the truth that others cannot. The real treasure is not buried in rivers. It is here, in the frenzy itself. And you are standing in the middle of it, wondering how long before the fever swallows you too. The spark that set California ablaze began quietly in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. In the chill of January, in the year 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall glimpsed something glinting in the water at Sutter's Mill. It was no larger than a fingernail, a flake of gold caught in the shallows of the American River. At first, he tried to keep the discovery quiet. He feared chaos, feared that John Sutter's dream of building an agricultural empire would be washed away in a tide of fortune hunters. But secrets rarely survive in restless lands. By the spring of that year, whispers turned into shouts. Newspapers carried bold headlines, and word spread far beyond California. From New York to New Orleans, from London to Lima, men packed their belongings and set their eyes on the West. By the year 1849, the flood had begun in earnest. Ships abandoned in San Francisco's harbor lay rotting in the bay, their crews rushing inland with pans and picks. A city that had once been a sleepy outpost of Mexico exploded into a boiling cauldron of tents, shacks, and gambling dens. The name 49ers was etched into the story of America, men who gave up everything to gamble on the riverbeds of California. The fever spread like wildfire. Farmers left their fields unplowed. Clerks abandoned their ledgers. Doctors, lawyers, and even preachers dropped their trades to chase a glittering promise. Men walked, rode, and sailed thousands of miles. Some trudged across the fever swamps of Panama. Others braved the Cape Horn route, where storms tore sails to ribbons. Still more crossed deserts with nothing but stubborn hope and barrels of water. For every story of a man who struck it rich, there were 100 of men who found nothing but exhaustion and despair. The sudden rush transformed the land itself. Prices soared overnight. Eggs fetched $1 apiece, boots cost more than a week's wages, and a simple tent could empty a man's purse. Gold dust became the currency of the day, pinched from pouches at saloon counters and weighed on makeshift scales that tilted conveniently in the owner's favor. Streets were mud by day and firelit chaos by night. Whiskey, dice, and whispered rumors of the next big strike drove men as fiercely as hunger. Yet beneath the frenzy, a different truth emerged. While the miners dreamed of fortunes buried in rock and river, another breed of opportunist was already carving their names into history. They saw what the gold seekers did not. The true wealth lay not in the soil, but in the desperation of the men clawing at it. In the chaos of San Francisco's streets, one voice rang louder than the rest. Samuel Brannan, a former Mormon-turned-merchant, became the first true millionaire of the California gold rush. Where others saw gold glittering in riverbeds, he saw profit shimmering in iron and wood. Long before crowds surged toward the American River, Brannan quietly moved through the city, buying up every shovel, pick, and pan he could find. By the time news broke wide, his shelves groaned under the very tools desperate men would soon kill to own. Brannan was a showman, and he knew that fortune needed fuel. On a hot May morning in the year 1848, he stormed through the streets of San Francisco, hat waving, vial of gold dust in hand, shouting, "Gold! Gold from the American River!" His words cut through the air like fire through dry brush. Men dropped their work, their tools, their families. The fever consumed them, and they sprinted toward the promise of riches. When they did, they turned first to Brannan's store, paying inflated prices for shovels that only days before had gathered dust. A pan that once sold for 20 cents now fetched $15. A pickaxe that had cost $1 sold for $6. In weeks, Brannan's fortune soared. He built more than a business. He built an empire of anticipation. Each rumor of a strike meant another surge of customers pounding at his doors. His wealth grew not from striking veins of gold, but from striking nerves of desperation. For Brannan, every prospector was a gambler, and he was the house. And, as history always reminds us, the house rarely loses. Yet Brannan was not simply a clever merchant. He was ruthless. His methods bordered on predatory, and his wealth came at the expense of men who often left the mountains penniless. Still, in the ledger of history, his name endures as a symbol of opportunism. While tens of thousands bent their backs against rivers, Brannan stayed in the city, his hands clean of dirt, yet heavy with coin. His story spread quickly. Newspapers across the United States marveled at his cunning, though some condemned him as a manipulator. But his lesson was unmistakable. The first true fortune of the California gold rush was not dug from the soil, but sold across a counter. Samuel Brannan proved a truth that has echoed through every frenzy in history. The men who sell the dream often make more than those who chase it. And in the frenzy of 1849, Brannan was the loudest seller of all. Amid the roar of gold fever, one man arrived, not with a pickaxe, but with a bundle of cloth. Levi Strauss, a Bavarian immigrant, stepped off a ship in San Francisco in the early 1850s, carrying bolts of sturdy canvas meant for tents and wagon covers. The city around him was a storm of shouting men, gambling dens, and ramshackle shops. Fortune hunters clawed at the ground by day and drowned their failures in whiskey by night. Levi noticed something different. He saw not their hands in the rivers, but their knees and elbows tearing through trousers before a week had passed. Miners, hardened by back-breaking labor, cursed the flimsiness of the clothes they brought west. Cotton ripped, seams split, and cheap cloth wore thin against jagged rock. A man might strike a vein of gold only to find himself half-dressed, trousers hanging in tatters. Levi listened. He realized that the miners did not just need hope. They needed clothes that could survive the dirt, the sweat, and the endless strain of the mines. At first, he stitched trousers from the canvas he had carried, pants stiff as board but durable enough to endure the grind. They sold quickly, word spreading through the camps like rumour. Soon, he turned to a sturdier cotton twill from Nimes in France, a fabric locals called serge de Nîmes. In California, the word shortened to denim. With the help of a tailor named Jacob Davis, Levi added copper rivets at stress points, reinforcing the weak seams that miners cursed the most. What began as a practical fix became a revolution in workwear. The trousers caught on, not only with miners but with labourers, blacksmiths, and ranch hands. They were tough, simple, and built to endure the grind of frontier life. Unlike gold dust, which slipped through fingers, Levi's invention endured. A single pair could outlast a season in the rivers, and for a man chasing fortune, that mattered. Every stitch became a promise of reliability in a land where so much else was uncertain. Levi Strauss never swung a pick in the Sierras. He did not gamble on claims or chase rumors through the mountains. Instead, he sold resilience, clothing that gave men the dignity of being clothed while the earth tore at their bodies. While many miners returned home penniless, Strauss stayed and built a brand that would outlive the gold rush itself. Today, jeans are worn in every corner of the world, from city streets to farm fields, from fashion runways to factory floors. Their roots lie in the muddy camps of California, where one merchant looked past the frenzy of gold to see what men truly needed. In that vision, Levi Strauss found a treasure greater than any vein in the rock. Not every fortune of the gold rush glittered in coins or shimmered in nuggets. Some fortunes began in the quiet counting rooms of supply stores where iron, nails, and rope stacked higher than any miner's pan. Collis P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins were not miners, nor did they pretend to be. They arrived in California with the same shrewd vision as Samuel Brannan and Levi Strauss. If men were willing to gamble everything in the rivers, someone needed to sell them the tools, the lumber, and the provisions to keep them alive long enough to chase their dreams. Huntington, a Connecticut Yankee with a sharp mind for business, and Hopkins, a cautious bookkeeper from New York, found themselves drawn together in Sacramento. The city was a raw frontier town, its streets a churn of mud and horses, its air thick with the cries of merchants and the stench of refuse. Miners trudged in from the mountains with pouches of gold dust, eager to spend it on food, hardware, or the comfort of a warm bed. Huntington and Hopkins met that hunger with shelves filled with the goods of civilization: hammers, saws, nails, canvas, and lamp oil, all the small things miners forgot to bring or quickly wore through. Their store prospered because they understood a truth miners often ignored. Dreams do not build themselves. Every camp needed supplies, every claim needed tools, and every exhausted man needed a merchant to sell them. They were not loud barkers like Samuel Brannan, but steady hands who counted coins carefully and reinvested with patience. By the mid-1850s, their profits stacked high enough to dream beyond the walls of a shop. That dream became iron rails. Huntington and Hopkins joined forces with two other Sacramento merchants, Leland Stanford and Charles Crocker. Together, the four men would become known as the Big Four, architects of the Central Pacific Railroad. Funded in part by the steady wealth they had built during the gold rush, they set their eyes on something far larger than shovels or canvas. They sought to bind the continent itself with steel. The Central Pacific, begun in the early 1860s, was no easy venture. Mountains loomed, labor was scarce, and politics was a constant battlefield. Yet Huntington's relentless drive for finance and Hopkins' meticulous bookkeeping became the backbone of the enterprise. What started as a modest supply store in a muddy frontier town transformed into a railroad empire that carried goods and people from the Pacific coast deep into the American heartland. Huntington and Hopkins never dug for gold, yet they mined something richer. They mined opportunity. Their story proved that the greatest treasures of the gold rush were not found in riverbeds, but in the networks of commerce that supplied, built, and ultimately reshaped America. In the early years of the gold rush, wealth moved in pouches tied to belts, in sacks stuffed under bunks, and in wooden chests rattling on the backs of wagons. The streets of San Francisco rang with the clatter of boots and the shouts of men eager to buy and sell, but beneath the surface ran an undercurrent of fear. Bandits lurked on mountain passes. Gambling dens fleeced miners of their dust before they reached a bank. Fraud flourished in a land where law was thin and justice often came at the end of a pistol. For every man who struck it rich, there was another who lost everything on the road home. Into this chaos stepped Henry Wells and William Fargo. Both had backgrounds in banking and express delivery in the East. They looked westward and saw not only gold dust, but a desperate need for safety and trust. In 1852, they founded Wells Fargo and Company, a name that quickly became a promise in a land where promises were scarce. At first, their service was simple: secure transport of gold, currency, and valuable parcels. Sturdy wagons painted in bright red carried strong boxes bound with iron, guarded by shotgun messengers whose very presence gave birth to the term riding shotgun. Miners who had once hidden their dust in boots or sewn it into their coats now brought it to Wells Fargo offices, where clerks recorded every ounce and locked it away. The company's green and gold sign became a beacon of reliability amid the chaos of the boomtowns. But Wells Fargo offered more than transport. They established banking services where none had existed, giving miners a place to deposit their earnings and merchants a means to conduct business across vast distances. Their stagecoaches became lifelines connecting scattered camps to cities, cities to ports, and the ports to the wider world. In a land where men often trusted no one, Wells Fargo became an institution of trust. The company grew rapidly, its network of express offices stretching across the West. Each strongbox that rattled over mountain roads was more than metal and wood. It was a symbol of order imposed on chaos, of stability in a world built on gamble and chance. Miners may have dreamed of striking fortune, but Wells and Fargo understood that the true treasure was in controlling the flow of wealth, not chasing it. By the time the initial frenzy of the gold rush began to fade, Wells Fargo was only beginning. Its stagecoaches and banks would endure long after the rivers ran dry, embedding themselves into the financial fabric of America. In the fevered days of the California rush, they proved that fortune favored not only the bold, but the organized. While names like Levi Strauss or Wells Fargo became legends, the gold rush was also shaped by 1,000 smaller fortunes built in the shadows of the frenzy. Not every merchant stitched his name into history books. Many were ordinary men and women who saw in the miners' hunger and exhaustion a chance to turn dust into dollars. For them, fortune was not in the rivers or mountains, but in whiskey bottles, bread ovens, and bedrolls. Boomtowns mushroomed overnight. Tents gave way to shacks, then to rows of saloons where light spilled from swinging doors and music from fiddles tangled with the roar of drunken laughter. Whiskey was liquid gold, a drink that loosened pockets faster than any promise of a strike. In San Francisco and the camps of the Sierra Nevada, a glass might cost the wages of an entire day. Some saloon keepers grew rich enough to rival merchants, their fortunes built on the misery and celebration of miners who lived on the edge of despair. Food was no less precious. With farmland scarce and supply lines stretched thin, a single egg in the early years of the rush could fetch $1, an astronomical price for men who remembered paying only a penny back east. Bread, butter, and fresh vegetables became luxuries rarer than gold dust. Enterprising bakers and grocers charged prices that drained pouches of gold as quickly as any gambling table. Miners often returned from the rivers not with fortunes but with enough for a single hot meal. The merchants who fed them quietly amassed steady profits that piled into small fortunes. Shelter was another prize. Inns, boarding houses, and even barns charged sums that would shock travelers in any other part of the country. A bed might cost $10 for a night. and in the crowded towns of 1849, men often paid just for a corner of floor. Landlords watched their fortunes swell while miners slept shoulder to shoulder in air thick with sweat and smoke. Women who ran kitchens and boarding houses became some of the most successful entrepreneurs of the rush, their reputations for a decent meal or a clean bed carrying more weight than a miner's tale of buried treasure. Beyond the city, blacksmiths hammered at iron, mending picks and shoeing mules. Tailors patched worn clothes, and washerwomen scrubbed shirts in icy rivers for fees that rivaled a labourer's wage. In a land obsessed with gold, these humble services built steady, reliable wealth. The lesson was the same in every camp and every town. While miners gambled their lives against the dirt, merchants built their fortunes one drink, one loaf, one bed at a time. Their names may not echo as loudly as Brannan or Strauss, but their wealth was just as real. The true economy of the gold rush was not only measured in nuggets, but in the relentless markups of daily survival. For every story of wealth plucked from a riverbed, there were hundreds of stories of ruin. The California gold rush drew more than 300,000 people to its mountains and valleys, yet the vast majority never struck a vein worth more than a few coins. Men dug until their hands bled, panned until their backs curved, and still walked away with nothing but exhaustion and debt. Camps were filled with broken spirits, men who had sold farms, abandoned families, and risked their lives on a dream that slipped like sand through their fingers. The math was cruel. A miner could toil from dawn to dusk and earn barely enough to cover food and lodging, while the merchant who sold him a meal or a shovel earned profits without leaving the city. A single egg could empty a prospector's purse faster than a day in the river could refill it. Whiskey poured into a glass cost more than many miners ever pulled from a pan. Failure was the miner's burden, yet it was the merchant's opportunity. The contrast became a bitter joke. The surest way to strike gold, people said, was to open a store. Samuel Brannan's shovels, Levi Strauss's riveted trousers, Huntington and Hopkins hardware, Wells Fargo's strongboxes, and the countless saloons and inns, these were the real claims that paid out, steady and sure. The gold dust that miners clawed from the earth often flowed straight into the hands of those who supplied them. The imbalance created a new hierarchy. Merchants built brick homes while miners huddled in canvas tents. Shopkeepers sent their children to schools while prospectors buried friends in shallow graves along the rivers. Women who ran kitchens earned reputations as shrewd entrepreneurs, while men in the mines earned little more than worn hands and disappointment. In the streets of San Francisco, fortunes glittered not in pans but in storefront windows, stacked in barrels of flour or folded into bolts of cloth. This was the hidden truth of the rush. While popular lore remembers daring prospectors striking it rich, reality tells a harsher story. Most miners, left with nothing, some with less than nothing, their debts heavier than the gold they dreamed of. But merchants, bankers, and saloon keepers carved steady wealth out of their failure. The frenzy that destroyed the hopes of many became the foundation of fortunes for a few. The gold rush was not a story of shared opportunity. It was a story of uneven reward, where the gamblers lost and the dealers prospered. The miners chased treasure in the soil, but the true treasure waited in the marketplace. And in the end, the divide between fortune and failure could be measured not in ounces of gold, but in who held the shovel and who sold it. Behind every glittering fortune of the gold rush lay a ledger written in blood and loss. California, before the frenzy, was home to thriving Native American communities whose lives were bound to the rivers and valleys. Within a few short years of 1848, that world unraveled. Thousands of miners flooded their lands, rivers choked with silt, hunting grounds stripped bare, and violence erupted wherever resistance appeared. Entire tribes were displaced, massacred, or starved as settlers seized territory with the blunt force of greed. By the end of the Gold Rush era, the native population of California had plummeted, the victims of disease, hunger, and systematic brutality. Immigrants, too, bore the weight of exploitation. Chinese laborers who arrived in the early 1850s dreamed of opportunity but found hostility instead. They worked abandoned claims that white miners deemed worthless, scraping out a living from the dust left behind. Yet even their persistence provoked resentment. Legislators imposed foreign miners' taxes, targeting the Chinese with levies designed to drive them out. Their camps were attacked, their rights dismissed, and their labor undervalued, even as their contributions built the very infrastructure that allowed California to thrive. The camps themselves were crucibles of hardship. Law was thin, and justice often swung from a noose or the barrel of a gun. Theft, brawls, and murders were common. Women who entered the mining regions were few, and many were drawn into prostitution, their lives consumed by the same desperation that fueled the rush. Disease spread easily in crowded camps and towns where sewage ran through streets and clean water was scarce. Cholera, dysentery, and fevers cut down men who had already gambled everything to be there. Even those who prospered sometimes found their wealth came at a moral cost. Samuel Brannan's inflated prices preyed on desperation. Saloon keepers profited from addiction and ruin. Merchants sold supplies at rates that bled miners dry. For every man who grew rich selling eggs or boots, another man starved in the mountains or staggered into town to sell his tools for a last drink. The gold rush reshaped California, but its foundations were soaked in tragedy. Wealth poured into cities, railroads, and banks, yet it left behind scarred lands, broken families, and shattered communities. For the merchants and entrepreneurs, the frenzy was a ladder to fortune. For countless others, it was a pit that swallowed lives whole. This was the cost of the real treasures of the gold rush. They did not come from nowhere. They were carved from the suffering of native tribes, the exploitation of immigrants, and the desperation of men who believed in a dream too fragile to hold. The gold that glittered in California's rivers faded quickly, but the fortunes built upon it endured. The miners who clawed at riverbeds are long forgotten, their names buried with their empty claims. Yet the merchants, bankers, and builders who sold to them left legacies that still shape the modern world. Levi Strauss's riveted trousers outlasted the frenzy of the 1850s, becoming the uniform not just of miners but of laborers, ranchers, and eventually ordinary people across the globe. Today, jeans are worn from Shanghai to San Francisco, from New York to Nairobi. Their origin lies in the mud and grit of California's camps, a simple solution to torn seams that grew into one of the world's most enduring fashions. Strauss never found a gold vein, yet he mined a seam of practicality that would outlast empires. Samuel Brannan's story ended differently. Though he became the first millionaire of the gold rush, his reckless spending and tangled politics drained his fortune, yet his role as the archetype of the shovel seller remains. His cunning reminded the world that fortune often favors not the dreamers, but the ones who sell the dream. Collis P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins carried their merchant profits into something larger, the Central Pacific Railroad. Alongside their partners, they carved steel tracks through the Sierra Nevada and bound California to the eastern states. Their wealth, first built on hardware and provisions, helped forge the very spine of America's continental connection. The railroad carried not just goods, but ideas, people, and power, extending the legacy of the gold rush far beyond mining camps. Wells and Fargo, whose stagecoaches once rattled with gold dust under armed guard, became one of the most recognizable institutions in American banking. Their green and gold signs spread across towns and cities, symbols of trust in a land once ruled by gamble and risk. They turned chaos into order, creating a financial network that endured long after the last prospector packed his pan away. Even the nameless profiteers left their mark. Saloon keepers and inn owners laid the groundwork for towns that would grow into cities. Blacksmiths, bakers, and washerwomen shaped communities where miners had only seen wilderness. While their names rarely survived, their influence did, building a foundation upon which California's economy expanded. The real treasures of the gold rush were not measured in ounces of gold, but in the businesses, institutions, and innovations that grew from it. They proved a timeless lesson. Fortune comes not only to those who dig, but to those who understand what dreamers need most. In this way, the gold rush was less about the dust pulled from rivers and more about the legacies built in its shadow. Step back from the muddy streets of San Francisco and the fevered cries of men chasing glitter in the rivers. What lingers from the California gold rush is not only the promise of sudden wealth, but the proof that fortune often belongs to those who look past frenzy and see opportunity. The rivers ran dry, the claims failed, and most miners left with nothing but broken backs and empty pouches. Yet the merchants who sold to them, the bankers who secured their dust, and the builders who turned profit into railroads and institutions left treasures that outlasted the gold itself. Levi Strauss's jeans still hang in closets around the world. Wells Fargo still stands as a symbol of finance. The railroads carved by Huntington and Hopkins remain as steel veins across the continent. Even the nameless saloon keepers and inn owners, the bakers and blacksmiths, shaped towns that grew into thriving cities. Their fortunes did not come from chance or luck, but from an understanding as old as commerce itself. When men chase dreams, someone must sell them the tools, the food, and the shelter to keep running. The gold rush reveals a timeless truth. In every age of frenzy, from the ancient Silk Road to the oil booms and stock market manias of modern times, the greatest fortunes are rarely won by those who gamble in the dirt. They are built by those who supply, who organize, who see the hunger in others and turn it into steady wealth. It is not always glamorous, and it is often ruthless, but it endures. The story of California's gold rush is remembered for its shimmering promise, but its real treasures were men and women who never swung a pick. They stitched trousers, poured whiskey, counted coins, and hammered nails, and in doing so, they built legacies that still shape the world we live in. The lesson remains: gold may glitter, but the true fortune often lies just behind the rush itself, waiting for those bold enough to recognize it.